Hello viewers from wherever you're watching us from. Welcome to another edition of your weekly State of Affairs program here on QTV. I'm your host, Aliou Sese, and of course, if you've been following developments, you will realize that the economic fallout from the Russia's invasion of Ukraine is another setback to the global economy. The toll on Kyiv, which is the capital of Ukraine, is immense, but the impact stretches far beyond the Ukraine borders. The severity of disruption is in commodity market and to supply chains had weighed heavily on macro-financial stability and growth, adding to an already complicated, of course, policy environment for countries still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. However, according to the World Bank latest report, the Gambia's economy continues to grow with gross domestic growth, that is the GDP growth projected at 5.5% between 2023 and 2025. The bank says the country has demonstrated extraordinary resilience in the face of the global economic concern, with a real GDP growth rate at 4.3% in 2022 alone. Well, joining me this week to discuss these and other issues, I have in the studio Dr. Usman Gajigo. Mr. Gajigo, welcome to State of Affairs program.
Thank you for having me.
And by introduction, Mr. Gajigo is an international development consultant. Until February of this year, he was the manager of the Microeconomic, Institutional and Development Impact Division in the Research Department of the African Development Bank. I mean, he has also worked at the World Bank and Columbia University. Like I said, he holds a PhD in development economics from the University of Wisconsin, Madison. His areas of expertise include finance, trade, entrepreneurship, labor market, agriculture economics, natural resources, and economics of education. Like I said, once again, thank you so much for coming on the program. To start with, what's your impression of the current global and, of course, the national economy?
Well, as you said, there's a lot of things happening globally, and Gambia being a small country that is quite exposed to what's happening globally, it obviously will be affected by things that are happening outside. So as is well known, the main impacts of this Ukraine-Russia crisis has been on the disruption of supply chains, and many things have been affected. Specifically, what's relevant for Gambia is that you've had there's been this disruption caused problems in terms of food price increase, energy prices, and fertilizer prices. All of these three combined in a way that really affected the Gambian economy. So it's not surprising that this effect, just like other countries in the sub-region, Gambia has been negatively affected, and our growth rate, what it would have been had this conflict not taken place, the difference is obviously lower. Now, as you pointed out, that the World Bank's projected growth rate for the country for the next couple of years is about 5%. Now, and of course, this is a very respectable growth rate, but it's important to put things in context. If you look at the growth rate, if you want to know how well the Gambian economy is doing, you can look at it in many different ways. You can look at the GDP growth rate. You can look at the other aspects in terms of cost of living, and you can go beyond technical numbers and obviously look at how people's standard of living fare currently compared to what it was yesterday, whether it's growing or not. So I think the picture is a bit more complicated in the case of the Gambia when we look at all of these three aspects.
And like you said, the impact of the pandemic and, of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine has no doubt affected not only in the Gambia, but the whole world is affected by this too. In your opinion, as an economist, what tools in terms of our fiscal and monetary policy do you think we can use to be able to deal with this issue?
Well, the thing at the moment during when the crisis occurs, there is there are a few things you can do at fiscal policies and monetary policies. When you have an economy like the Gambia that is import dependent, in fact, import as a share of our GDP is close to about is well over 40%. We export very little. What we export is a few, and it's a very small percentage. So we constantly run a trade deficit. We also have a current account deficit. So Gambia being food dependent, when you have shocks food import dependent, when you have shocks to those items, and you have this global inflation because of the shocks to supply chain, the disruption to supply chain, we will obviously face a very significant, terms of trade shock. It means the value of our exports relative to our imports fall. So, our limited foreign exchange reserves quickly gets used up. Consumers face a very huge price increase. So, in effect, that means that there is a very, very big fall in real income. So, what government can do in the short term basically is to see how they can ease things, reduce some of tax burdens, do some positive transfers. Some of these things have been done, but at best what these things can do is just to mitigate some of the impact. Of course, monetary policy have to be a bit more accommodative to things like that. But fundamentally, the responsibility for the government is to make sure that the economy is resilient to shocks over time. And you don't wait until these shocks happen and then you try to come after the fact, because what you can do after the fact is very limited. What you can do, which is many years before, is try to transform the economy. And this is unfortunately what has been missing in the Gambia. Fundamentally, the structure of our economy hasn't changed from what it was 10 years ago or a couple of decades earlier. We essentially have the same economic structure, which is very vulnerable to the slightest kind of shocks. There's very little you can do after the fact.
And like you said, this is a country that depends highly on import. We export little. But how can we reverse this dependency on imports?
Well, there are a couple of things. Fundamentally, you have to look at, there are a couple of many things you can look at. But let's look at imports. Look at the things we import. Virtually everything we import in terms of food, these are things we can grow in the we can actually grow in the country. We import a huge quantity of rice, but we have the arable land area to import. To actually meet our consumption need, maybe even export. Vegetable oil. Basically, if the main components of our imports are basically, there are some things we can't. Maybe some aspects of energy we have to import. But when you look at food, which is a big part of our import bill, these are things we actually can produce here. So over time, what the government needs to do is to find ways of transforming the economy. And this is not only possible, it's feasible, and feasible within a very reasonable time period, is to transform the economy, make sure we have a structural change, particularly in areas of agriculture. You first of all start with the issue of increasing productivity, because without productivity, you're not going to have structural transformation in agriculture. And from that, you go into processing and manufacturing. By just addressing those aspects, you can have a situation where by our exposure to global events that disrupt supply chains and lead to price shocks, where we are forced to import inflation, can be completely remedied. When you also do that, and then you do this transformation, from being a food-dependent country to a country that becomes largely self-sufficient and is able to do some basic processing, you also start on the path to be able to export. Then you have this situation also where your export is not only on a few unprocessed commodities and tourism, but then you have a much more diversified base where you can export, and you become a lot more resilient to shocks. Because one of the reasons why COVID-19 caused a major contraction in our economy is that it didn't affect much our imports, but it affected our export. Why? Because our export, our foreign exchange earnings are based on what tourism receives. Yeah. So when the source countries of those tourists put in travel restrictions and tourists couldn't come in, what did we face? We basically had zero tourists. So there was a huge fall in our only export earning, because we have no other source of export earning. And as a result, our GDP contracted, and then we had a growth rate of less than 1%. So what we need, to answer your question, is a transformation of our economy. And this is something that is impossible. this is something that has to take a generation. No, you need a recognition of the fact that our economy is still the same, what it was on the Jammeh, what it was on the Jawara, and the need to address and change what needs to be changed in there. And this is something that can be done. It is feasible. It's within the means of the current government, and it's something that can be done in a very reasonable time period.
You talk about the agriculture sector. I mean, we have seen the government under Barrow is trying to invest more in the sector with so many projects coming in to improve the agriculture sector. Like you said, we have the lands and we have all what it takes to be able to grow some of the things that we import from outside. But how do you think, I mean, the government will be able to actualize or realize its dreams as far as the agriculture sector is concerned?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, when you listen to the government, or for example, in the case of Barrow, his State of the Nation address, what you hear is no different from, you get this sense that things are not going to change. Number one, whenever you hear a government talking about what I'm doing in agriculture, and the first thing they start doing is listing projects A, B, and C. Well, we've had these projects years, decades. You know, if you go to Sapo today, which is a major agricultural center up country, you will find many, compounds within Sapo which are basis of previous agricultural projects. But have any of those projects over time succeeded in transforming the agricultural sector? What is different about the projects that the president mentioned on during his address that is fundamentally different about about those things? If you want to transform the agricultural sector, the sort of indicators, the sort of actions, and the sort of policies that need to be implemented are very different from what the government has been communicating. For instance, there was no mention during the president's address about some basic glaring deficiencies we have. If you look at rice cultivation, for example, in CRR we have huge areas, tracts of land that are highly suited for rice production. Yet we are only exploiting a small percentage of that. Now compare our rice yield, that is the output per given area that we've been having over the past couple of decades, and compare that with Senegal. The rice yield in the Gambia still hasn't exceeded 3 tons per hectare. About 20 years ago, we were at the same level of yield with Senegal. But currently, the rice yield in Senegal is approaching about 5 metric tons per hectare. Gambia is still stuck at the same level.
But is this all done by just the government in Senegal, for example? I mean,
no,
private individuals, private sector.
Yeah, it's a combination of many things.
Exactly.
These are not government projects, but
okay.
What the private sector can do is a function of the policy, environment, and the investment climate. It is the investment climate in the country, which is largely under the control of the government, that determines the quantity and the type of private sector investments you get in any sector. Now, in Senegal, obviously, they've been able to get a lot of, there have been public projects, but at the same time, a lot of private investors, some domestic, some foreign. But it is the improvements, the significant improvements in the investment climate, which are directly under the policies of the government, that has contributed in attracting the kind of investments that allowed that productivity growth to happen, and then set them on the path to having structural transformation within the agricultural sector.
And in the case of the Gambia, what will you recommend for private individuals, of course the private sector, that would love to invest in the agriculture sector?
Well, the first thing you want to ask, I mean, are you in Gambia, for instance? We have a lot of Gambians in diaspora. Of course, whenever we talk about the Gambians in diaspora, the first thing we talk about is remittances. Yeah. But remittances are just a fraction of the benefits that the country can get from the diaspora. I personally have known some Gambians who have come back to invest in agriculture, and they run into a lot of difficulties. I myself, actually, I run a couple of farms in the country, and I do know the difficulties as a Gambian entrepreneur that you run into, in terms of whether tax, in terms of documentation, in the access to finance, all sort of things that the government has some sort of control over through their policies. These are very, very far from optimal. So there are a lot of things. So it's making it easy for private businesses to import the machines they need. Today, if you want to import something, most people find it easier to go to Dakar to import, because it's so long and so cumbersome to import through Banjul. This is a fact. We are not a landlocked country. We are a coastal country. We have a port. Yet people have difficulty exporting to such an extent that they are using the port of Dakar.
But plans are on to expand the ports.
Absolutely, eventually. Yeah. But we've had the port forever since independence. Should we reach at a stage where a large percentage of the population or investors are using a foreign port when we are, a country on the shore? So you also have issues of other issues that are within the ability of the government to influence. This is, access to finance, the infrastructure that you have. Currently today, the reason why a large part of CRR is not being cultivated is because the irrigation infrastructure has actually dilapidated over time. Areas that used to be cultivated multiple times per year now are only cultivated one time per year. So there are many other things the government can do. Unfortunately, those things are not being done, and simply listing projects that we do not initiate but that are just brought to us from international organizations like IFAD, FAO here and there, projects that run only 5 years and then they exit. Those projects do not lead to agricultural transformation.
In one of your write-ups, I read, you state it is true that the Gambia truly needs foreign investors if you want to develop economically. But does this mean every foreigner with few dollars, will automatically result in economic development? Absolutely not.
It matters what kind of investors you need. During Jammeh's time, we had investors coming in, but we know what some of those investors were doing. The kind of investment climate you have, how predictable your rules are, how committed public officials are to implementing policies as opposed to looking at only their private gains. These determine the short of it, the quantity of investment you get and the quality of those investors. You can have investors who come in and they want to meet directly the minister or the president. Is a big red flag, because a legitimate investor who comes in, the first office of call should be at GAIPA. Okay. They should not bypass GAIPA and go to the minister or go to the office of the president.
What is wrong about perhaps meeting the minister or meeting the president for an investment opportunity that we want to bring to the country? What is wrong about that if that investment is going to impact on the country?
Absolutely, there's nothing wrong with that. I didn't say it's wrong to meet the minister. What I said is it's wrong to bypass the office that is created to actually attract and meet investors, make sure that they follow our investment code, make sure that the sort of regulations, rules, everything that we have in place are there. The experts for managing, welcoming those investors, by the structure of our governments, are in GAIPA, under the Ministry of Industry and Trade. So eventually, that's absolutely not, just like any ordinary Gambian.
But GAIPA is under a ministry. Yes. And certainly, before anything is signed, GAIPA must be in the know.
Yes, it should be. That's how it should be. But what I'm trying to tell you is things have been signed where GAIPA was completely bypassed. And when that happens, when that happens, it tends to actually lead to bad investments.
Example of where? We will want to assume, but example of which agreement or contract that was done without GAIPA's...
The recent scandal involving the security port thing, that was negotiated at the level of Office of the President, completely bypassing GAIPA. And as we know, the details about that has been thoroughly investigated, and it was the subject of a report by the Auditor General's Office that was presented to the National Assembly. That shows all the problems with that particular investment.
And let's now, from foreign investors, let's now come back home. Local investors. We have so many Gambians who are doing big in the country. Employing hundreds, if not thousands of Gambians and contributing to the socio-economic development of this country. They say charity begins at home. I will cite the example of the Q Group, Chairman Mohamed Jah. What role do you think local investors can play towards our economy? And what are some of the opportunities you think governments will create for them to be able to explore?
I think these are for me, to have foreign investors is a great thing. It will help us a lot. But what should really be the vanguard of our development, private sector-led development, should be the local investors. More than anything, if you look at countries that have really developed, there usually are some local champions. You have some local investors that have started that are, I mean, Q Group is a very good example. I'm sure there are many other examples, but local investors that are investing in transformative sectors, you know, doing processing, you know, technology. The thing, I mentioned a thing about diaspora.
Yeah.
Now, imagine a foreign investor, imagine bringing an investor, let's say, from another country, and a Gambian investor. Even though they are, both groups are putting in a large amount of their resources, you know, the one group, you know, has a home somewhere. Yeah. And if things get a bit tough, they will either go to another country or go home. Yeah. But for the local investor, the Gambian, this is their home. Yeah. It will take, I mean, it's not only the return that is driving their investment, but they're actually investing in their own future. You know, so if whatever the government can do to motivate and encourage and facilitate the investment of local investors, that goes beyond just what the returns of those local investors, but it's an investment into the future of the country. So I don't think the government can do too much in terms of encouraging local investors. They actually should be the vanguard of private sector-led growth in the country. And
what sort of policies do you think the government should put in place? I mean, to make them more proactive, to make them, you know, to at least to sort of inspire them to do more.
No, absolutely. I mean,
especially when it comes in terms of taxes here and there.
Yes.
I mean, those are some of the areas that one will argue. But as an economist, do you think that is sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that are sustainable. I mean, there are a couple of things. I mean, there are a lot of things that are sustainable, some that are not sustainable. It depends on in what context you use them and how you use them in a coordinated way towards an overall objective. Just like you would have in investment incentives for foreign investors, don't think that the local investors don't need incentives. I mean, there are a lot of things that are difficult, very tough in terms of the investment climate in the Gambia. Though recently, one has to acknowledge that GRA has done a good job of like reducing the corporate income tax rate, but the tax base in the Gambia is very low. See, what I mean by the tax base, like the total size of the entities that pay tax is very low. There are still many segments of the economy that do not pay tax,
and this is a tax-based country.
Exactly, and then the few that do pay tax, they end up paying, the tax burden on them becomes excessively high. But we know that many investments, they require a lot of time to mature over time. It's very important, for instance, when you have an investor, like even a local investor who's coming in, that the sort of incentives that you give to foreign investors, they are also needed by local investors. For instance, somebody, you know, let's say they want to set up like a manufacturing plant. I mean, that giving them a tax break for like 5 years until their cash flow becomes positive, this is something that is essential. I mean, some people may look at that and say, oh, the government is going to, you know, lose some tax revenue. But the thing is, what you may lose in few years, you will more than recoup that when that investment matures, that farm grows, and then over time is able to create employment, and then, you know, generate more tax revenue over time. Other things like, you know, making sure that we are investing significantly in infrastructure. You know, without infrastructure, particularly in energy, no modern business really can function. And when power outage happens, everything comes to a stop. So there are a lot of things we can do. And what I would emphasize is the tendency not to restrict investment incentives only for foreign investors, but to understand that, you know, some of all these domestic investors, long term, the benefits of their investment would actually exceed some foreign investors. And then governments would also should definitely look at what sort of incentives they give to local investors.
And even when it comes to bidding process, I mean, will you suggest, I mean, more priorities be given to local investors than foreign investors?
Yeah, At some level, yes, I'll be a bit careful about that.
Exactly.
You want to make sure that when the bidding...
But without compromising
yes.
the quality of the services being provided.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, you can, just like you can have a policy where, let's say, if you want to have a bit more gender balance, you give a sort of some points to, the underrepresented female entrepreneurs. It would be good, obviously, to give some recognition of maybe some disadvantages that local investors would have relative to a foreign investor. But as you said, it's important not to compromise, quality. So if there's a bidding for certain service that the government needs, the first priority should be to have the entity that has the technical ability to deliver. Now, once that minimum threshold is reached, then other factors maybe can be brought to bear, But yes, I think in principle you can do that. It would be a specific. That would be biddings would be one specific example. But actually, in the big scheme of things, bidding for government services or contracts would be a tiny fraction of what investors, local or international, would be engaged in.
I just want to come in here. For decades, I mean, one will say our road infrastructure in this country has not been, very good. I mean, but currently we have seen there's so many road construction here and there. I mean, do you see any link between good road network and unlocking, the opportunities in our economy and, of course, economic growth?
Absolutely. I mean, when you talk in any country that has gone through significant development, infrastructural development has played a very major role. So roads are obviously key. They are very central. You are quite right. We've had very poor road networks since independence, and we've seen some improvements. And recently, as we are seeing, within the combos and many rural areas, a lot of road constructions are ongoing. So the road constructions that are going, the government must be commended for that. Yes, it is important. However, sometimes the most visible things in any particular sector are usually not the most important. Sometimes some of the hidden aspects are more important. Let me give an example here to sort of make my point. If we want to talk about education sector, and then you say, oh, the government has built a lot of schools recently. Yes, you have to grant that to them. They've built a lot of schools, but schools are still an input. What we really would be interested in the education sector is to know whether the students are actually learning, whether the curriculum is adapted to our needs, our labor market and other things, whether, the actual learning. At the end of the day, when kids graduate from Gambian school, are they learning? The same thing for roads. It's good to be building many roads, but at the same time, it's important that, those roads, when they are constructed, there is a plan and an actual implementation plan for maintaining them. One thing that is true in all of Africa is it's not difficult to see roads being paved, but there is very little plan in place to ensure that they are maintained over time. And with the sort of weather we have in the Gambia here, even a world standard road after a while would immediately need some major repairs. Of course, we have on paper we have a road fund that is supposed to do road maintenance, but the reality is, it's only funded through fuel surcharge. But if you look at the roads that we have that require maintenance, the size of that road funds is very insufficient. And in fact, as you build more roads, the gap between what you need for maintaining that and what you have become even greater. So while we, obviously, we should acknowledge the roads that are being built, the next question we should be asking is, would these roads still be in this condition 2 or 3 years from now? And are there any plans to make sure that, the kilometers of roads that are being counted actually contribute to infrastructural development? Because it's not the roads by themselves, it's the services from the roads that facilitate communication between entities in the country that actually leads to development. When that maintenance is not in place, as we currently lack, then these roads are not going to contribute long-term over a sustained period of time.
It's quite interesting. I'm sure the Ministry of Works, Transport and Works will take note of this. Maintenance is quite relevant as far as, these infrastructure projects are concerned. Well, viewers, you're watching QTV's State of Affairs program. I am Aliou Cissé, and my guest this week is Dr. Ousmane Gadjigo, an economist. We'll go with a short break, and when we return, discussion continues. Do stay tuned.
Espas Motors is the largest and most modern auto service in the Gambia. Espas Motors is the only authorized dealer in Chevy, Mercedes-Benz trucks, Mercedes-Benz buses, Kia, Ford, Futon Mini and Midi buses, Futon trucks. At Espas Motors, we have qualified professionals who use modern technology to diagnose and repair all brands of motor vehicles. Espas Motor services include auto sales, auto repairs, vehicle painting, availability of high-quality spare parts, towing services. We are reachable at any time. Call Espas Motors on 352222 353-4444 or locate us on the Bertil Harding Highway. Espas Motors.
Hello viewers, welcome back from that short break. You're watching QTV State of Affairs program here on QTV, the Gambia's first private TV station. And we are broadcasting from our studios here on Kairaba Avenue. My name is Aliou Cissé, and my guest this week is Dr. Ousmane Gadjigo, an economist who has worked with the African Development Bank. Mr. Gadjigo, welcome back, and once again, good to have you on the program. We were discussing the importance of the road networks, in relation to our economy. Not long ago, we've seen, the government signed, performance contract agreement with the state-owned enterprises such as GPA, GNPC, and Social Security. Do you think government should consider privatization of these SOEs or what?
Yeah, state-owned enterprises are, when they are created for the right reason and they are managed very well, they can be very useful for the country. Well, first of all, they generate revenue. In theory, they should generate income for the government. Some of them are created to provide services that the private sector, is currently unable to or is not in a position to do. So, in many countries, for instance, in some Asian countries, some of the biggest sources of revenue to the government is state-owned enterprises. An example is Vietnam, for instance. The situation in the Gambia is very different. We have a lot of state-owned enterprises. I don't remember the exact number, but it's over 10.
Around 13?
Yes,
yeah.
Somewhere between 10 and 15.
Yeah.
The thing, some of them a few are doing well, but most of them are not actually doing well. In fact, on net, they are a liability to the government.
Government is paying off some of the loans that they took. So I
Indeed.
think that's the more reason why government came up with this idea to have this, performance contract agreement with them. Yeah,
but the thing with now you have to ask yourself. Now, that's a reason why the government came up with the performance idea. But if this is a problem you want to address, you have to go back to why they are failing. Yes, see. There are several reasons for this, and Gambia is not the first country with state-owned enterprises, and this issue has been studied very, very well. When you have state-owned enterprises that are supposed to be providing a certain good, and they are supposed to operate as enterprises, but then they are not operated as enterprises. Like you appoint, directors or board members who have no private sector background, it is not going to operate well. Let's say one of the state-owned enterprises could be, let's say, Gamtel, for instance, or Gamcell. Now, Gamcell is a competitor to QCell. Now, QCell are pure private sector enterprises. But if the appointments that are made in Gamcell at the level of the board and at the level of key management officials are not based on competence, but based on people from the public sector alone, do you think it will be able to compete? No, and as we know, it's not competing. In fact, Gamcell is costing the Gambia government hundreds of millions of dollars per year. It's actually functionally bankrupt as we speak right now. Its liabilities far exceed its assets. That's a specific example. But the point being, sometimes you have state-owned enterprises that are given tasks that is not part of their mandates. They are asked to do something. that is not that they are not designed to do, or they are asked to perform a service and the government doesn't pay them. But much more fundamentally, they are basically the appointments, the decision making in terms of how they are run. It is not consistent with what they are created for. So as long as you have those sort of structures there, those are not addressed at the fundamental level, you can have a million performance contract, nothing will change. Because at the end of the day, if Gamcel doesn't meet that performance contract, what's going to happen? Nothing. Because if something was going to happen, it would have happened before the need for the performance contract would have been there in the first place. So the performance contract, I'm afraid, is just a pure show. If you don't address the fundamental problems of why state-owned enterprises are not performing as they should, these performance contracts would just be things that sound nice on paper, but they won't change anything.
But do you think it is helpful for government to continue, subsidizing these SOEs or paying off loans on behalf of these SOEs? Absolutely
not. So I forgot to address your point about privatization. So some entities, that should be looked into. If you have a state-owned enterprise providing a service that is a public good, and there is no other entity that can provide that, you need to find a way to structure that, make sure it works well. Like NAWEC. NAWEC, you just can't go and sell off. It is the only it's the only enterprise that's providing electricity and water. And most of that is a public good. So NAWEC, we just have to find a way of restructuring, and thankfully it is undergoing some restructuring. But there are other state-owned enterprises that are providing something that there are substitutes for. There are other private sector entities that are doing a good job of providing that service. So if the government is losing millions, there is no reason for it. So in the case of Gamcel, you have QCell. In fact, Gambia has 4 mobile operators. Many countries that are way bigger than Gambia have only 2 or 3. So Gambia doesn't need 4. So if how many young persons have you seen with a Gamcel number? The only people you see with Gamcel numbers are public officials, or some legacy number. Any young person would be taking their number from one of those private ones. So the point I'm making is that there should be no reason for certain state-owned enterprises for the government to be keeping them there and the country to be losing money when they could either be restructured or they could be privatized. Now, I'm not going to say which one is going to be privatized or not. I mean, you would need to look at a lot more of the financial fundamentals of that state-owned enterprise to make that determination. But it suffices to say that if you have a state-owned enterprise that costing the government millions of dollars per year, it needs very careful look at how it is being operated and how it is being managed.
I mean, you talk about the issue of NAWEC. I will come in here. I mean, in the case of NAWEC, should the water division and the electricity division be decoupled?
I mean, this is something that has been discussed and looked at in many ways. For instance, in the country's, I think, energy roadmap, that is something that has been looked at as a possibility. I mean, in many countries this has been done. Does it have to be the case that they have to be decoupled in order for NAWEC to work? No. But one has to look carefully to see whether that might accelerate the process of reforms. Like I said, right now I don't have the details in front of me to be able to definitively make a statement as to whether it should be decoupled or not. But I believe that's something that should be seriously looked into. And if I'm not mistaken, the energy roadmap that the government signed recently, which was approved by the cabinet and in conjunction with, and that the World Bank and other development partners are financing, this is an issue that was looked into. So it wouldn't be, I think it's a very, very important point to consider.
How about having the private sector coming in to invest in the energy sector and water as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, in many countries now, the whole energy, if you look at energy, for instance, you have like 3 broad areas. You have generation, you have transmission, and distribution. Yeah. Now, in the area of generation, this is an area where the private sector can take over, because you can have independent power producers. You don't need to have you don't need to have government power plants like the one in Kotu or Brikama. Private investors can come and set up their power plants, many of them. And then you can have a government-owned entity that is like buying electricity in bulk. That would be buying power from that. Then it will fade through the transmission company. Normally, the transmission sector is not amenable for many operators. But then the distribution is also an area that can be liberalized, where you can have many distributors in many geographic areas. So this is something the government is currently aware, and having independent power producers is part of the country's current energy roadmap. The key question to ask is, why are we not seeing a lot of private investors coming in, when in reality there is nothing legally preventing them from coming in? This goes back to our earlier point, because private investors coming in, private independent power producers coming in are just like any other private investors. But there's a key difference here. If you build a power plant, this is a major investment, number one, and it's a long-term investment. In fact, you tend to have a power purchase agreement that goes for like 20 or 30 years. So an investor that is coming outside to put in millions of dollars in a power plant has to be very comfortable about the investment climate of the country. Once you don't have that comfort, you're going to have difficulty getting private investors to come in and invest in the energy sector.
What's your reaction, to the government's green recovery focused national development plan, which replaced the national development plan, that's 2018-2021, which has been underway and it's been approved by cabinet?
Yeah. I don't know how much, whether they've gone to this stage where they've done a lot of consultations publicly. I know the NDP that is actually being, whose implementation has just passed now. There was some, consultations and discussions about it. This particular one, I have not seen much details about it. I've heard mentions of it, but I have not seen the document itself. But what really leads to development and changes things on the ground is not documents. These are documents that are, I'm an international consultant. If you ask me to draft a new national development plan, it would take me a few weeks to draft you a document. There are millions of other people who can do it. The document is not useful by itself. It's just a piece of paper.
It's a guideline.
It's a guideline, but also, it's a guideline that people already have in their head what they are going to do. What matters is how you execute what is in it. The question we want to ask ourselves now, before we focus too much on this new one that's coming, is, okay, the NDP that ran from 18 to 21, let's look at what was planned in it, what were the projections in it, and how did we perform relative to that? And what can we learn from the failure to execute exactly what was in that plan? I think if we have a very honest discussion about that, then we are more likely to have a more fruitful discussion on what we should expect from the new one. Because the new one should have a very, very comprehensive section on our experience with the NDP and what are the lessons that we've learned from it.
If you were to draft or prepare a new plan for the country, what will be your key priorities?
Like I said, the Gambia, so if we look at how our economy is right now, and we've talked about this, so it will be almost like repeating myself, because, again, we are an import-dependent country. The things that we import, are things that we can grow here. Fundamentally, you need to have agricultural transformation. The process of transforming that agriculture would lead to structural transformation of the economy, and will also enable our economy to be a bit more resilient to shocks, not only domestically, like shocks that we normally have, like drought or other weather-related shocks, but shocks that come from outside. But when you are talking about transforming the agricultural sector, the last thing you want to talk about is listing of projects that we have. Projects A, B, and C funded by international organizations A, B, and C. Right now, what you're actually experiencing is that not only in terms of investment in the sectors, but our revenue at the central government level is falling because needed reforms that we need to do to unlock more support from our partners have not been done, and therefore our partners are pulling back their support to the government right now. So which also hampers the ability of the government to do even more. So you end up going in some sort of a very adverse feedback loop where a lack of reforms lead to less support, and less support makes it difficult to implement more reforms. And you have this negative feedback loop. So the point here is you have to look at the situation we are in, make a complete break from the past. But any a way of developing the country, or any sort of development plan has to look at what our economy is right now, and if we have an import-dependent country, and how do we transform that into a diversified economy and change the structure of it.
And talking about how to diversify our economy, just this week, the International Monetary Fund, Executive Board approved $6.6 million to the Gambia to help meet what it calls the country's financial needs, and of course address the repercussions of the war in Ukraine and support the post-pandemic recovery. Mm-hmm. And according to the IMF, they went further to say the Gambia's performance under the economic program supported by the extended credit facility has been broadly satisfactory despite the challenges of trade disruptions.
Yeah. No, like I said, when you look at GDP, when IMF is looking at your economic performance, of course they look at many other things, but the biggest indicator is GDP, just like the World Bank you mentioned earlier. Yeah. But see, when we talk about a 5% GDP growth rate, what is the population growth rate in the Gambia? It's about 3%. So it means GDP per capita, GDP income per capita has only grown at about 2%. Now, if your income per capita is growing only at about 2%, ask yourself this: how long will it take before your current income actually doubles? It will take more than a generation. Is that, as a Gambian, is that satisfactory? Should that be satisfactory to us? That it will take more than a generation before the average income level in the Gambia doubles? I don't find that satisfactory, and I don't think we should. Yeah. So, going back earlier, if we want to have an honest discussion as to whether we are doing well or we are doing okay, there are many things to look at. You have to go beyond these macroeconomic numbers. They mask a lot of things. Inflation, for instance, is currently at what?
As at April 2023, 17.4%.
Good.
Compared to 13.1% in January this year.
Exactly.
According to the Central Bank
yes.
Of the Gambia.
This first of all, this number is high, but it's masking something even it's masking even something bigger. See, this is the general price increase, but we know that the consumption basket of the average Gambian is composed, over 50% is composed of food and energy, and these are the ones that have experienced a significant growth. So for the average Gambians, in fact, the acuteness of the price increase is far higher than what that number is actually showing.
Even though we have seen the central bank saying it is tightening the monetary policy to be able to tame, the inflationary pressures.
The downside of that obviously would be that when you do tighten monetary policy, of course, it tends to have an adverse effect on economic growth. So it's a very tough balancing act, but it's understandable response from central bank, because you don't want inflation to basically go on out of control spiral. So, but policies that tend to kind of control it a bit also have an adverse effect on economic growth. So, like I said, whenever you are in a situation where a government is reacting to these things after the fact, you can only mitigate it to such an extent, which is why actions that are needed to transform the economy are needed, not only today, but since yesterday.
As part of the government efforts to deal with the impact of the pandemic, we've seen the government comes with what it calls the fuel subsidy. Among others, there was tax waiver on those who import rice in the country. But yet, the prices of, for example, rice continue to rise.
Yeah, indeed.
Isn't this a concern, despite having the tax waiver and all those stuff for these rice importers?
Of course, having those tax waiver, like I said, those are all fiscal policy policies meant to blunt some of this impact, to sort of limit that impact for the ordinary Gambians. Of course, on the margin, they'll have some effect, but it will be like basically putting a Band-Aid on a deep wound. It doesn't address the fundamental weakness of the economy. Like I said, if we had the right agricultural policies and we are not dependent on rice imports now, and we have the means, the land area and the arable area to actually meet our domestic consumption, it's easy to see how the inflationary effect of importing rice, would have been diminished if we are not importing. In fact, if we were actually a net rice producer, higher global prices for rice would have been a benefit for us, because then it would increase our foreign earnings. So if you are a net producer of a commodity and there is an increase in global price of that commodity, you have a positive terms of trade shock. We are experiencing the opposite of that. So because we import rice, and price of rice has gone up as a result of the Ukraine crisis and other effects. Even though Ukraine doesn't export rice, because rice and wheat
export more wheat here.
Yeah, rice and wheat are substitutes. They are cereal substitutes. So when the price of one goes up, it will have a cross price effect on the other, and as a result of that, rice price will go up, and we will face the negative consequences of that higher prices. So it will manifest itself in many ways. Inflation will happen. Our limited foreign exchange reserves, which only cover a few months of imports, will be quickly gone. The government, it will spend precious resources that we have instead of investing them somewhere, but cutting taxes. It means by cutting taxes, we have less to invest in things that the government should normally finance.
Earlier on, we mentioned the fact that the Gambia is a tax-based economy. As a developing country, you are in a dilemma between providing services and getting what it requires to provide those services. Many will talk about the issue of cutting down, borrowing. As an economist, is there any country in this world that doesn't borrow?
No, I'm not aware of a country that doesn't borrow, but every country borrows.
Okay.
Just like most people borrow money, even people who are extremely rich. Even the richest person today has some loans. Elon Musk has some loans.
Yes, some will say the government should stop borrowing. So that's why I'm asking this question as an economist. Yes. Do you agree with those people?
Well, no, it's not that simple. Borrowing can be useful. Like I said, almost every country borrows. It's how you borrow, what you do with what you borrow. See, when you borrow something, and let's say you borrow money at a particular interest rate, let's say 5%, you go and invest into something useful and get a return of 10%. Then you have a net return. You can easily pay back your loan and then have the benefit of that extra return that you've earned. So it's what you borrow, but also what you borrow. When you borrow, you also need to know. You also need to be in a position to be able to actually pay back. So it's the what you use the borrowing for, the quantity that you borrow, and how you're able to manage it. In the case of the Gambia, there are a couple of issues with what we borrow on our debt level. First of all, our debt level is very high. As a percentage of GDP, it's about 70%. It's about almost $2 billion in debt. Now, the issue is that some of that money that have been borrowed, let's say by state-owned enterprises, have not been invested well, and yet they've been borrowed at very high interest rate, at commercial rates. And these are some of these were borrowed well before this government comes in. So that we also need to make clear. That's true. Yeah. So some of these are legacy loans. Exactly. But we are on the hook. We must pay for them. Exactly. Yeah. But you also have a situation where the government itself doesn't even have a good idea of what it has borrowed and how much it has to pay at the given. I can give one specific example, and this is something that has been noted by.
Just summarize it. We're running out of time now.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Basically, the point being is there's nothing wrong that it's not wrong that we are borrowing, but we are borrowing beyond our means, and we are borrowing and using those debts in a way that are not bringing in returns to meet the cost of those debts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ousmane Gadjigo. Quite interesting and insightful discussion. Well, viewers, with that we bring an end to this week's edition of the State of Affairs program. Our guest this week was Dr. Ousmane Gadjigo, a former manager of Microeconomic Institutional and Development Impact Division in the Research Department of the African Development Bank. Mr. Gadjigo, thank you so much for being on the State of Affairs program, and we hope to have you in our subsequent edition to discuss more about our economy, because it is important. Well, viewers, with that, we bring an end. Do join us next week. Until then, bye-bye from me and the entire team.